They say what you allow is what will continue. I used to believe that kindness, patience, and sacrifice would always be rewarded within a family. But on one October morning, standing on my own porch, with my neighbors watching and my cheeks stinging from a slap delivered by my own daughter-in-law, I realized how dangerously wrong I had been. That was the moment I decided to stop allowing and to start fighting back. Before we dive into this story, let me ask you, if your child's spouse squandered hundreds of thousands of dollars, then raised her hand against you in front of the whole neighborhood, would you forgive or would you fight? Before we go deeper into this dramatic journey, and don't forget to subscribe to Quiet Revenge Tales and ring the notification bell. Here, you'll always find stories of sacrifice, betrayal, and the quiet but powerful reversals that bring justice home. And tell me, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. Who knows, our next story might remind you of something you've lived through yourself: the garden, the car, and the suitcases. My name is Margaret Collins. I was 64 years old when the peace of my small suburban street in Ohio was shattered. That Tuesday morning, I had been in the garden, trimming the last roses of the season. The smell of damp earth, the chill of early autumn air, it all felt grounding. Until I heard the slam of car doors. It was my son's SUV, a sound I knew as well as my own heartbeat. Terrence, my only child, my pride, my reason for working double shifts for decades, was home. But this time, something felt different. The doors didn't shut with casual ease. They banged like declarations of war. When I rounded the corner, I saw him, thinner than usual, tie askew, shoulders slumped, and beside him, Lennox, his wife, stood tall in designer boots, blonde hair gleaming even in the gray morning light. At her feet, 2 enormous suitcases. My breath caught. Suitcases never mean good news in family stories. Inside the house. "Mom, we need to talk," Terrence said, his voice heavy. I led them into my modest living room, the same space where I'd celebrated his birthdays, where his father had read him bedtime stories. Now, Lennox's sharp eyes scanned every piece of furniture as though calculating what she might replace or take. "We sold the house," Terrence finally said. I remember how carefully I set my coffee cup down, how my fingers trembled though I tried to hide it. "Which house?" "Our house. Maple Street, Maple Street. The Colonial I had contributed $40,000 from my retirement savings to help them buy. The house where I had painted walls until my back ached. The house where I had planted daffodils, imagining future grandchildren playing in the yard." "You sold it?" My voice was a whisper. Lennox's tone was cool, smug even. "We didn't need permission, Margaret." It was our house, and then came the number. 6. $120,000. The money that vanished. At first, I thought, perhaps they were upgrading, perhaps they wanted to move closer to a better school district. My hope clung to me like ivy. But when I asked, Terrence dropped his gaze, and Lennox leaned back with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I had expenses," she said. "Jewelry, spa retreats, cars, some debts, and I invested $300,000 in my friend's boutique." My knees nearly gave out. $300,000 on a boutique? I looked at my son, praying he'd say it wasn't true, but his silence told me everything. Do you know that moment when you realize the child you raised, the boy you nursed through fevers and cheered for at graduations, has become a stranger? That's what I felt in my bones that morning. The request. Then came the final blow. "We were hoping we could stay here. Just temporarily, of course," Terrence said. "Stay, in my 2-bedroom, 1-bath home. After burning through more money than I'd seen in a lifetime." "No," I whispered, though part of me hated saying it to my own son. Lennox's smile cracked into fury. "No? You've lived in this tiny house your whole life, wearing the same clothes, driving the same car. You don't understand standards. My husband made a business decision. Business decision. That phrase would echo in my mind for months, neighbors as witnesses. When I refused them, the shouting grew louder. Lennox's words cut like knives, accusing me of jealousy, of being bitter, of clinging to a son who chose her over me. And then the front door flung open. She dragged their bags outside, screaming for the neighborhood to hear. Look at her! Throwing her own son out on the street. Mrs. Patterson across the street froze mid-watering can. The Johnson boys stopped mowing the lawn. Eyes stared, whispers spread, and I, Margaret Collins, felt the humiliation crawl across my skin. That's when it happened. The crack of her palm across my cheek, loud, public, unmistakable. The snap. The sting wasn't just physical. It was years of sacrifice burned into a single second of betrayal. I had fed them, supported them, given up my retirement cushion for their future. And here I was, an old woman slapped in broad daylight like common trash. I looked at Terrence. He didn't move. He didn't defend me. He only stared hollow-eyed. And I knew right then that I had lost my son to this woman. But I also knew something else. I would no longer be silent. The first step toward war. You have 5 minutes to get your bags and leave my property, I said, my voice steady though my heart thundered. If you don't, I'm calling the police. You wouldn't dare, Lennox sneered. So I dared. I dialed 911 in front of them, my neighbors as witnesses, my dignity as shield. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes, and for the first time, I realized I was not powerless. If you've ever been cornered by family, shamed for saying no, or made to feel guilty for setting boundaries, you understand what was happening in that moment. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between protecting your peace and pleasing your children? This was only the beginning. A slap on the porch was nothing compared to the storm that would follow. Because beneath the ashes of betrayal, I found documents, secrets, and truths that would turn the tide in my favor and leave my daughter-in-law facing not just me, but the law itself. The police arrived within minutes. Blue and red lights bounced against the windows of my quiet street, turning the morning into a spectacle. My neighbors, still gathered like an impromptu jury, whispered among themselves as 2 officers stepped onto my porch. "This woman assaulted me," I said, pointing at the cheek still stinging from Lennox's slap. "She's lying," Lennox snapped, her voice pitched high with indignation. "We just needed a place to stay." "She's heartless, throwing her own son out on the street." Officer Martinez, a calm young woman, tilted her head. "Ma'am, multiple witnesses saw you strike Mrs. Collins." She turned to Mrs. Patterson, who nodded vigorously. "She hit Margaret right across the face." For the first time, Lennox's confidence faltered. But before I could breathe, my son spoke. "Mom, did you really have to call the police?" Terrence's voice cracked with something between accusation and despair. "Yes," I replied firmly, "because silence is how this went on for so long. And I won't be silent anymore." Seeds of doubt. That afternoon, after giving my statement at the station, I sat at my kitchen table staring at a cup of untouched tea. My husband's chair sat empty across from me, a reminder of the man who had once promised me I'd never face the world alone. But he was gone, and now it was just me, and a son who seemed like a stranger. Yet even in the haze of humiliation, something sparked in my mind. Maple Street, the down payment, the lawyer's insistence years ago that I sign a promissory note when I gave Terrence that $40,000 from my retirement. I rushed to my file cabinet, heart pounding, and there it was, the document neatly folded, my son's signature beside mine, outlining repayment terms and interest. At the time, I'd thought it unnecessary. "Family doesn't need contracts," I had said. But the lawyer had insisted. Now, years later, It was the one thing that gave me leverage. The lawyer. The next morning, I sat in James Crawford's office. He was a silver-haired attorney with kind eyes and the patience of a man who'd seen families destroy each other over money too many times before. After I poured out the whole story, the sale, the wasted $620,000, the slap, the police, he leaned back in his chair. "Margaret, you have stronger legal standing than you realize. That note secures your loan against the property. They sold the house without satisfying the debt. That's breach of contract and potentially fraud." "Fraud," I repeated, my voice trembling. "Yes, and given the assault, you also have criminal grounds. You can sue for damages, interest, and legal fees. They owe you more than $60,000. My chest tightened. I had never wanted to fight my son, but maybe this was the only way to wake him up. The motel later that day, Terrence called. His voice was weary. "Mom, Lennox made bail. Can we talk?" "No," I said steady. "There's nothing left to discuss. You sold a house that wasn't fully yours. You owe me $40,000 plus interest. I filed a lawsuit." The silence on the other end stretched long, heavy. "You're suing us?" "We're family, exactly. That's why it hurts so much." A stranger couldn't have cut this deep. "Mom, we don't have $60,000. You should have thought of that before letting her spend $500,000 on jewelry and spas." I could hear Lennox yelling in the background, her voice shrill, full of venom. "Tell her she's insane. Tell her we'll countersue for emotional distress." "Let her try," I replied coolly. "I have witnesses, documents, and proof." "What does she have?" "Lies, the investigators' findings." 3 days later, James called. His voice was grave. "Margaret, we've uncovered more. Your daughter-in-law. She's been running this game for years. Before your son, there were 2 other men. Both left her after discovering she'd drained their accounts. I felt my blood run cold. And the boutique? There is no boutique, no license, no storefront. It was just a scheme to funnel $300,000 to her so-called friend. But that's not all, I braced myself. She's been having an affair. For at least 6 months. The man is wealthy, married. Your son's money funded the jewelry, the vacations, the hotels. The world tilted. My poor Terrence, so devoted, so blind, had been nothing but an ATM for a woman who mocked him behind his back. The confrontation. That evening, Terrence called again. His voice shook. "Mom, Lennox says you're spreading lies." "Are you?" "Ask her about Richard Hawthorne," I said evenly. The phone went silent, then muffled shouting, and finally Terrence's broken voice. "She says she doesn't know him. He's 52, owns a construction company, drives a black Mercedes." He ended it when his wife found out. "Every spa trip, every jewel, funded by your marriage and your misery." In the background, I heard Lennox scream denials, threats, her fury unhinged. "Terrence," I said softly, "think. Who convinced you to sell the house? Who spent $600,000 in months? Who slapped your mother in front of the entire neighborhood?" He didn't answer, just heavy breathing. Then, click, the line went dead. A son's awakening. The next morning, James called again. "Terrence wants to meet. He sounds different." When I saw him at the office, my heart cracked. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in a week, hollow eyes, trembling hands. But when James laid out the investigators' evidence, receipts, testimonies, hotel bookings, my son finally broke. Tears ran down his face. "She's been lying to me for years, and I chose her over you. I let her destroy us." "No, son," I whispered. "She manipulated you. But you can still take your life back." He nodded slowly. "I'll file for divorce. And I won't fight the lawsuit. You deserve to be paid. Back. Every penny." For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe I hadn't lost him forever, but the storm wasn't over. Hope, however, is fragile. 3 days after Terrence filed for divorce, Lennox showed up at my house at 6 in the morning, mascara streaked, hair wild, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You destroyed my marriage, Margaret. You turned him against me with your lies." The neighborhood lights flickered on, dogs barked, curtains twitched. I pressed the intercom of my new security system. "Leave my property, Lennox! Or I'm calling the police again." "Good!" she shrieked. "Let them hear how you ruined my life." And then she began shouting personal details, our finances, the lawsuit, the affair, broadcasting our family's private wounds for every neighbor to record on their phones. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was war. Have you ever had a family member air your private pain in public just to humiliate you? How did you react? Share your story in the comments. I want to know I'm not the only one who's lived through this kind of betrayal. What came next would test not just my patience, but my very faith in family and justice. Because Lennox wasn't just manipulative, she was dangerous. And she wasn't about to let go without burning everything around her. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and nerves. I had sat on those benches before, weddings, town meetings, jury duty, but never like this. Never with my own son and his wife as the other side of the aisle. By the time our first hearing was scheduled, Lennox had already tried to twist the story to anyone who would listen. To the neighbors, I was a vindictive mother-in-law. To Terrence's colleagues, she hinted I was jealous of her success. And now, with her lawyer at her side, she looked every bit the victim. Hair sleek, dress demure, eyes downcast as though she had been the one betrayed. But beneath the mask, I saw the same woman who had slapped me on my own porch, and I had something she didn't expect. Proof. The promissory note. James Crawford, my lawyer, placed the document gently on the judge's bench. "Your Honor, this is a legally binding promissory note. $40,000 loaned by my client secured against the Maple Street property. 3 years of missed payments. The defendant sold the home without satisfying the lien." The judge adjusted her glasses, scanning the signature. "Mrs. Collins's son signed this?" "Yes, Your Honor." Without repayment, the sale constitutes conversion of secured property. Lennox's lawyer leapt up. It was family money. There was no intention to collect. The judge raised an eyebrow. And yet, there is a signed agreement. "Mrs. Lennox, are you disputing this is your husband's signature?" Lennox shifted, face pale. "No, but..." "Then the intention is irrelevant. A loan is a loan." For the first time, I saw Lennox's composure falter in front of someone she couldn't manipulate. The investigator's trump card. James wasn't finished. "Your Honor, we also have reason to believe Mrs. Lennox diverted over $600,000 in marital funds under false pretenses, jewelry, vacations, a non-existent boutique, and we can prove it." He gestured to the back of the courtroom. A man in a tailored suit stepped forward, his jaw tight. Richard Hawthorne, the so-called businessman who had been Lennox's lover. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Terrence's head snapped up. His hands trembled. Under oath, Richard admitted it. The dinners, the jewelry, the spa trips, all funded by Lennox. All while she claimed she was a wealthy woman separating from an abusive husband. His voice cracked as he said, "I was deceived, too." Lennox's face drained of color. She whispered furiously to her attorney, but the damage was done. Terrence buried his face in his hands. The son I thought I lost that evening. We met again in James's office. Terrence looked smaller than ever, his shoulders hunched as though carrying not just debt, but shame. "Mom," he whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." I let her control everything. I thought she was sophisticated, successful. I thought she made me better. But she was stealing from me, cheating on me. And when you tried to warn me, I chose her over you. I reached across the desk, touching his hand like I had when he was a boy with fevers in the night. "You were manipulated, Terrence." "That doesn't erase your responsibility. but it explains your blindness. What matters now is what you do next. His jaw set. I'm filing for divorce, and I'll pay you back, every cent. For the first time, I felt the faint stirrings of my son's strength returning, Lennox's counterattack. But Lennox was not a woman who surrendered. Days before our next court date, she appeared at my workplace. I was balancing spreadsheets when the receptionist whispered, "Your daughter-in-law is here." She won't leave. There she stood in the lobby, draped in designer clothes, voice loud enough for every coworker to hear. "I just want 5 minutes, Margaret. 5 minutes to make this right." The audacity left me breathless. In front of strangers, she tried to play the part of the contrite wife. "I know I made mistakes, but you don't want to destroy me, do you?" I answered calmly. "Pay me the $67,000 you owe, and the lawsuit ends." Her mask slipped. Her eyes hardened. "I don't have that kind of money." "But don't think this is over. I have things on Terrence. Things you don't know. And if you keep pushing, I'll use them." Then she walked out, leaving a chill in the air and my coworkers staring at me as if I'd stepped out of a soap opera. The son's confession. That night, I called Terrence. "She says she has things on you." "What does she mean?" Silence stretched on the line. Finally, his voice broke. "Mom, when we first married, I did things I'm ashamed of. I lied on a mortgage application, falsified documents to get a better loan. I didn't report some cash income. Lennox kept copies of everything. She said it was for our records, but now I see. She was keeping leverage." My heart twisted. My boy, manipulated not only into debt and disgrace, but into crimes that could cost him his freedom. "Terrence, you need to tell James," I urged. "If she brings it up first, she'll destroy you. But if you come clean, we can control how it's revealed." Tears cracked his voice. "If I do, I could lose my job, maybe face charges. And if you don't, she'll own you forever." Which is worse. The turning point. The next morning, James listened to Terrence's confession, his face grave but steady. "This complicates things," he admitted, "but the statute of limitations has passed on some of it. The rest can be mitigated with voluntary disclosure and penalties. Most importantly, Lennox can't use it to blackmail you anymore." For the first time in years, my son straightened his back. He wasn't out of the woods, but he was facing forward, facing truth. And I, an aging widow with nothing but a promissory note and a wounded heart, suddenly realized I had something stronger than Lennox ever expected, a willingness to fight. If you were in my shoes, would you protect your child from the consequences of their mistakes? Or would you let them face the full weight of justice to finally break free? Share your thoughts in the comments, because for me, this choice was both punishment and mercy. The courtroom showdown was coming, and in that worn wooden chamber before a stern-faced judge, the lies that Lennox had built her empire on would finally collapse. The courtroom buzzed like a hive the morning of our final hearing. Fluorescent lights cast a pale glow across the benches, and the air smelled of nervous sweat and polished wood. I sat at James Crawford's table, my hands clasped tight, my heart steady but heavy. Across from me, Lennox swept into the room on a cloud of perfume, her blue dress perfectly tailored, her hair freshly styled. She was playing the role she knew best, the misunderstood wife, the victim of a cruel mother-in-law. And for a moment I saw jurors and onlookers glance at her with sympathy. But masks don't last forever. The defense's story. Her attorney, a sharp-tongued woman named Sarah Chen, went first. She painted Lennox as a young wife overwhelmed by circumstances, sabotaged by a mother-in-law who had never truly accepted her. "Your Honor," she said, voice dripping with practiced sorrow, "my client admits to financial mistakes, but who hasn't made mistakes in their youth? Mrs. Collins has escalated a family dispute into a vendetta, hiring investigators, pushing for divorce, even dragging private marital issues into court. This is harassment disguised as justice. Lennox dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. A few murmurs of sympathy fluttered around the courtroom. I felt the weight of judgment shift until James stood. Facts, not fiction. Your Honor, James began, his voice steady as granite, this is not a vendetta. This is a case of systematic deception and fraud. He placed the promissory note on the judge's desk, a $40,000 loan, signed, notarized, and secured against the marital home. 3 years of missed payments. Then the home was sold without satisfying the lien. That alone is breach of contract. The judge nodded. And you have proof of missed payments? James handed over a stack of documents. Emails, bank statements, my calls and messages ignored. The judge leafed through them, her expression darkening. But James wasn't finished. The witness. Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness, Richard Hawthorne. Heads turned as Richard entered, his tailored suit impeccable, though shame weighed on his shoulders. He avoided Lennox's eyes, his lips pressed tight. Under oath, he confessed it all. Yes, I had a relationship with Mrs. Lennox Collins. She told me she was wealthy, separating from an abusive husband, and that her mother-in-law was trying to steal her inheritance. I believed her. I gave her money, gifts. She spent large sums from her husband's accounts to maintain our relationship. A gasp rippled through the room. Terence, sitting beside me, bowed his head into his hands. James's voice cut through the silence. Mr. Hawthorne, are you aware that the boutique Mrs. Collins claimed to invest $300,000 in does not exist? Richard's eyes widened. No, I assumed it was legitimate. If I'd known, that will be all. The courtroom was no longer sympathetic. Cracks in the mask Lennoxes. Lawyers scrambled to recover. Your Honor, an affair may be morally questionable, but it's irrelevant to the financial dispute. But the judge leaned forward, her silver hair gleaming under the lights. Irrelevant? This affair was funded with stolen money, Mrs. Chen. That makes it very relevant. Lennox's composure shattered. Her face turned red, her voice shrill. You don't understand. I had to do it. Terence never gave me anything. I deserve more than that shabby house, that tiny car. I brought standards into his life. The outburst hung in the air like smoke. The courtroom watched, wide-eyed. For once, there was no mask, only entitlement laid bare. Terence's stand. The judge turned to my son. Mr. Collins, do you dispute that your wife spent over $600,000 in a matter of months? Terence's voice shook, but his words were clear. No, Your Honor. She drained everything, and when I tried to resist, she threatened me. She even kept evidence of my mistakes from years ago to blackmail me. I was blind but not innocent, and I'm done protecting her. I watched my son finally stand, not as the boy I'd raised, but as a man willing to face consequences. Tears burned my eyes, but this time they were tears of something like pride. The verdict. The judge's voice was steady, sharp. Mrs. Lennox Collins, I have rarely seen such blatant disregard for responsibility. You borrowed $40,000 and refused to repay it. You sold a home without satisfying a lien. You spent $600,000 on luxuries, lies, and infidelity. And when confronted, you assaulted your mother-in-law in front of witnesses. This is not mismanagement. This is fraud. Lennox gasped. I rule in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Sai, Margaret Collins. The defendants are ordered to repay $67,000 within 30 days, including interest and damages. Failure to do so will result in wage garnishment and asset seizure. Furthermore, I am forwarding this case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal fraud charges. The gavel struck like thunder. The aftermath in the hallway. Outside the courtroom, Lennox's sobs echoed off the marble walls. She lunged at Terrence, clawing at his sleeve. "You spineless coward, you let her destroy us!" He peeled her fingers away. His voice was quiet, final. "No, Lennox. You destroyed yourself. I'm filing for divorce today," she screamed, the sound feral, raw. But Terrence walked past her without looking back, and for the first time, I felt the chains she'd wrapped around him beginning to break. A question for you. If you were sitting in that courtroom, watching a woman who drained her family's future and mocked her own mother-in-law finally face justice, how would you feel? Relieved? Vindicated? Or perhaps, like me, torn between triumph and heartbreak? Because while the verdict was satisfying, I still walked away with a wound. The knowledge that my son had nearly been lost forever. Seeds of healing. That evening, Terrence came to my home. He stood on the porch where months earlier his wife had slapped me, his eyes weary but clear. "Mom," he said softly, "I don't deserve forgiveness. But I want to make things right." I opened the door. For the first time in a long time, I let him step inside. Justice had been served. Revenge in its quiet legal form was complete. But healing, that would take longer. This was not the end, but the beginning of something new. A mother reclaiming her dignity, a son reclaiming his freedom, and a woman who had lived her life in shadows learning that sometimes justice arrives in a courtroom with the weight of a gavel. The weeks after the verdict passed slowly, like the cooling embers of a fire that had nearly consumed everything. My cheek had long since healed from the slap, but the wound to my heart still throbbed, deeper than any bruise. And yet each morning as the sun spilled through the lace curtains of my little house, I found myself breathing easier. The silence that once felt heavy now carried a different weight. Peace. Lennox disappeared from our town almost overnight. Some said she ran to another city. Others whispered about charges still hanging over her. I didn't care where she went. For the first time in years, she wasn't standing on my porch, wasn't whispering poison into my son's ear, a son's return. Terrence came by one Sunday afternoon carrying a paper bag with groceries. He looked younger somehow, as though laying down the burden of her manipulation had lifted 10 years from his face. "Mom," he said quietly, setting the bag on the counter. "I signed the divorce papers." I studied him, my only child, the boy I had once rocked to sleep through storms. His hands trembled, but his eyes were clear. "It won't be easy," I told him, "but sometimes the hardest roads lead us home." He sank into the kitchen chair, head in his hands. I don't know how I let it go this far. "I thought she loved me. I thought she made me better." "She made you blind," I said gently. "But blindness can heal when the light comes." And then, in the quiet of my small kitchen, my son wept, not with the shame of betrayal, but with the relief of release, the money and the moral debt. Within 30 days, the court's order stood firm. Lennox's accounts were frozen, her assets seized. The repayment of $67,000 returned to me, not as a victory, but as a strange kind of justice. Money, after all, had never been my true concern. What I wanted back was dignity, respect, the simple acknowledgement that sacrifices made in love should not be twisted into weapons. When the check arrived, I tucked it into a savings account and whispered a prayer of thanks, not for wealth, but for clarity. Healing the garden. One morning, as the air turned crisp with winter's breath, I went back to my roses, the same garden where it all began, where a car door slammed and 2 suitcases appeared like omens. Terrence joined me, hands clumsy with pruning shears, but trying. "Dad used to love this," he murmured, clipping a stem. "He did," I said, smiling faintly. "And so did you. Do you remember? You used to run through these rows, chasing butterflies." He chuckled softly, a sound I hadn't heard in months. I'd forgotten. "Families forget," I said, "but they can remember again." And in that garden, with the winter sun low on the horizon, I began to believe it. Community and witnesses. The neighbors who had once whispered now stopped me at the mailbox. Mrs. Patterson clasped my hand. "Margaret, you were brave." Most women your age would have stayed quiet, endured for the sake of peace. You stood up. You reminded all of us that boundaries matter. Her words lodged in my chest like an unexpected gift, because for so long I had thought of myself as weak, an aging widow with little but memories and a mortgage. Yet here I was, seen as strong. If you're listening to this and you've ever been made to feel powerless in your own family, hear me now. Silence is not strength. Boundaries are not cruelty. Protecting yourself is not betrayal. The final encounter, months later, I received a letter. Lennox's handwriting slanted and hurried. She begged forgiveness, claimed she had been lost and pressured by the world's expectations. She asked for another chance, another open door. I read it once, then again, and finally I burned it in the fireplace. Because forgiveness, I realized, does not mean re-entry. Some doors once closed must remain locked, reflection and moral. When I look back now, I see more than betrayal. I see the quiet power of saying no, the dignity of standing firm, even when your heart aches. I remember the judge's words, "This is not poor financial management. This is systematic fraud." And I think of how often women like me, mothers, widows, givers, are told that we are overreacting, that family should be endured at any cost. But no. Family is built on respect, not exploitation. And love without boundaries is not love at all. It's a prison. A message for you. If you've ever sacrificed for your children only to be mocked, ignored, or used, know this: you are not alone. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal from the very people you raised, you are not weak. And if you've ever doubted your worth because others took advantage of your kindness, hear me. Your dignity is priceless. So let me ask you, what would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed silent to keep the peace, or would you have fought back like I did? Tell me in the comments. Because your story, your voice, matters here. The closing. As I sit now in my quiet home, roses blooming again, my son visiting every Sunday, I feel something I thought I had lost forever. Peace. Not because revenge tasted sweet, but because justice was done and dignity restored. And I want you to remember this, too. Respect isn't given by blood. It's earned through love and kindness. Here at Quiet Revenge Tales, we tell these stories not just to stir emotions, but to remind each of us. Betrayal may wound, but justice, in its quiet way, can heal. So if this story touched you, leave a comment, share your own experience, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell, because more tales of sacrifice, betrayal, and unexpected justice are on their way. Together, we are not just listeners of stories. We are a community, and here, no one suffers in silence.